Ferrari that I have ever seen in the whole of my life. He's out of the race! He's out of the race! Oh my goodness, this is fantastic! And I've got to stop because I've got a lump in my throat.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Maximum Downforce, episode 6 of the Formula 1 2021 World Championship. I am your host, Will Knight, as always, and joining me in today's episode is Harry Parkhouse, Ryan Ferris, and our TCR head editor, Phil Kinch. Phil, now we've just been discussing this. You don't often watch Formula 1 because obviously there are different motorsport categories out there for everyone, but it was a race which was, in my eyes, probably the best of the season that we've had so far. Just give me your thoughts on the Grand Prix weekend.
So I thoroughly enjoyed this one. It's not often I can say that about a Formula 1 race, I'll be honest. But yes, this one was a complete eye-opener. Had everyone on the edge of their seats. I'll be honest, I was talked into it by my younger stepson because he loves Formula 1. He's mad on it and still thinks I should be, but still, you know, I get old and crotchety. But yes, it was a really, really good event. A really good podium as far as the top three at the end of the race. Some surprising twists and turns, especially on a street circuit, which you'd normally say, you know, if it's Monaco, you'd think procession, but Baku obviously has provided something different for a change. Yeah, thoroughly enjoyed it. Would definitely watch this one again. And I think there's plenty, obviously, as we'll do this evening, to talk about from what came out of it.
Before the weekend even got underway, or the race got underway, practice and qualifying were absolute madness. We had several crashes in FP1, FP2, and FP3. Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc, Nikita Mazepin, Lando Norris, and Valtteri Bottas both going down escape roads. And then in qualifying, we had 4 red flags, and that is actually the joint most red flags in a Formula 1 session. It is a record equaler. Was that a sign of things to come, do you think, that this weekend was going to be abnormal? And if so, why was there such a big issue in Baku?
I would say that, yes, if you've got disrupted qualifying, if you've got disrupted free practice, it's definitely a sign that you're in for a race that's going to be topsy-turvy, that's going to turn the form book on its head. It's you know, okay, they last raced there in 2019. They've had a year away, but in the nicest way possible. These guys aren't race rusty. You go to a circuit, race drivers go to a circuit, spend a lot of time before free practice doing track walks, understanding the circuit itself, the different nuances and ways to, you know, understand each corner, the racing line, and make sure they are mentally prepared for what they're taking on before they even go into free practice to begin with. So race rustiness is definitely not an issue. Having not been there for a year, again, I can't see that with all the various simulator work the Formula 1 teams do nowadays, the preparation that goes into it. And at the same time, I personally think it's almost as if they've been released after Monaco. You know, Monaco was a big talking point for Formula 1 with Max taking his win and Lewis struggling. I wonder if it's a case of, you know, everyone sort of got there and thought, hang on a minute, we're actually on a circuit. We can race on this. We can overtake on this. I'm not knocking Monaco. It has its preferences. But it's a case of, right, we're here. We can do this. We can race. What can we throw at this to get the best result possible? I just think everyone was pushing really hard. We're still in the first half of the season, which is almost the most important part of the Formula 1 itself. Normally in the first half of the season, that's where you score the most points, and then you're going into defence mode in the second half. So I still think it almost had a tinge of schoolboy racing the first week back at school, but you're sort of 6 races into the season now.
Harry, turn 15 was quite a point of interest throughout the weekend. We had Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc, like I just mentioned, in FP1 and FP2 respectively. And many obviously went into qualifying thinking that it would be a big talking point, who would crash. It was Lance Stroll and Antonio Giovinazzi. We'll get onto another crash of Lance Stroll in just a moment, Harry. But with turn 15 being such a point of interest, and obviously the castle section, which is a renowned corner for catching out drivers, do you feel that turn 15 has now taken on the mantra of being the hardest corner around the Baku City circuit, or are there other points around the track which are more difficult for the drivers?
I think overall, when you get to a street circuit, it's always going to be a technically demanding track. But at Baku, you saw a lot more crashes and a lot more incidents than you did at Monaco. And obviously, you mentioned the turn 15. It's slightly, as you go up the hill and then down dipping into it with the curb, it's definitely something that the drivers have to look at with the curb hitting and whether you will crunch into the wall afterwards if you hit the curb at too much apex speed. So it is certainly a demanding track, and that corner is definitely something that the drivers have to take lightly. And I think it became easier, obviously, as the weekend went on. And we saw a lot of mistakes there in qualifying, mainly due to, obviously, the low fuel mode that they were running. And, of course, trying to go maximum pace, fast as you possibly can through the corner without hitting the wall. And a lot came a cropper of it. But we also saw, I think, around turn 3 with Tsunoda and Sainz in qualifying, both went off at the same time. They had struggles there. And I watched a compilation of over the past couple of years. Every single corner, there's been crashes or incidents around the track. So clearly, it's one of those that skill is a massive benefactor within the rider or the drivers' minds. So the likes of Perez, Vettel, and Gasly on the podium really showed their skill, specifically over the course of the weekend, to keep it out of the barriers, and of course managed to finish it up on the podium. Hamilton, with obviously the mistake and whatever happened with his brakes at the restart, but it became a race of attrition really, and basically who's going to last longest out at the front, and it was Perez who did it in the end. And there was no real incidents at the castle section, I believe, in the race. Only Carlos Sainz locked up before going into it, and that dropped him down quite a few positions, down to 15th, I believe, but he did manage to recover for some strong points. But it is certainly a demanding track, and I would imagine that afterwards quite physically demanding, as we saw with Perez as well. When he was talking about defending from Hamilton, he was saying that he was sweating throughout the entire race, which you can understand, especially around a street circuit. And it's one that I think many, many fans of the sport would love to see every single year. Of course, we've had it since 2016, the European Grand Prix, but the absence of it last year sort of was a bit of a down for the fans, I guess. But coming back to it and getting the enjoyment in the final few laps and the street circuit, proper racing between the cars, it was certainly a spectacle to watch.
Especially with the Singapore Grand Prix weekend now being announced as being cancelled during the middle of the Azerbaijan Grand Prix weekend. This is most likely the final opportunity we will have this year to see street racing, and really it lived up to its reputation. So the 5th race around Baku really did deliver the action to the fans. But Ryan, as Harry just spoke about him, it was Sergio Perez who took his first race win for Red Bull, his second race win of his career. It was definitely quite a deserved win in terms of he kept his nose clean, he didn't have any issues, and at the end of the day, luck was on his side. We had the issues with Hamilton and Verstappen, we'll get onto those later. But is this finally Perez emerging as the driver which Red Bull need, defending from Hamilton, and when something goes wrong for Verstappen, he is there to pick up the pieces?
Yeah, I think it is. I saw a stat earlier comparing the teammates and the number of points that they'd scored after 6 races at Red Bull when they'd paired with Verstappen, and Perez is only a few points shy of what Ricciardo managed to do in the first 6 races of that Verstappen's teammate. I think Ricciardo scored 72 points to, Perez is on something like 69 points now. And he is head and shoulders above what the likes of Albon and Gasly managed to do. So he's definitely shown that he's got on top of that Red Bull now. He got caught up with the red flag incident, which meant he wasn't able to put down the fastest lap that he could possibly do in Q3. But then as he has shown in the past few races, he has got phenomenal race pace in that Red Bull, and within a matter of a few laps, he pulled through and was playing rear gunner for Max Verstappen, which is something Red Bull have been wanting ever since Ricciardo's left, really.
Now, like you just mentioned, the comparison between Daniel Ricciardo and Sergio Perez. Perez is living up to being the teammate that Verstappen needs, and arguably the driver that Red Bull needs. And you'll notice that I've started here with no offense to Perez and Bottas, but the second drivers, because we'll put Hamilton and Verstappen together as we normally do. But Phil, Bottas, safe to say he had a very poor weekend. And there's no getting around it. There's no questioning today what went wrong for Bottas. Was it tyres? Was it the car? We know it was a combination of things. But ultimately, he just wasn't on the pace compared to Hamilton yet again. So my question is to you, in such a debate, while George Russell, this is the only point I can really think about Russell, to be honest, because he was absolutely nowhere this race. And so jamming it into one question, should Russell be going to Mercedes next year? Because many I've seen have brought up the argument that the likes of Mick Schumacher are ahead of George Russell in the championship standings, and some counteracting that with the fact that one result doesn't define a championship season. But if you were Toto Wolff in this current situation, what would you do with your driver lineup?
I would be looking seriously at the results of Bottas. Hamilton's results are very clear. He's delivering as he should do. And that's not an issue on his side. But Bottas, I personally feel, is not delivering. If there was ever a question of who is a clear number 2 driver in the team, it's him. It is definitely Bottas, and his performances at the moment, I believe when I was watching the race, he was 10th at one stage. He was dropping down to 13th or possibly 14th, and you're almost looking at a repeat of the Russell-Bottas battle we had back at Imola. If I was Toto Wolff, I would be seriously considering a driver change potentially mid-season, and not waiting until next year, because as it's often shown in Formula One, if you put a driver in mid-season into a good car, they will often thrive within the first few races. It's when you sit there and put the pressure on of here's a full season drive, there is more pressure on them, and they don't always seem to do so well. And especially with Red Bull being so strong this year, as you say, Perez has shown he's now up to speed on things. He's taken his victory. He held off Hamilton race long. I would seriously be considering and saying, look, we need a driver alongside Hamilton who can do exactly the same as Perez and also bank points in the constructors when we need it. I'd be looking at putting Russell in mid-season now and not waiting until next year. And in that situation, it would then obviously sort of force Williams into calling up their reserve drivers and putting them in place. But yeah, if they're serious about the championship, I think something sooner needs to happen myself.
And moving on from one side of the Mercedes garage, Harry, to the other, Lewis Hamilton had quite a consistent Grand Prix in the fact that he was behind Sergio Perez for the majority of the race. He led it in the early stages, but eventually got caught by Verstappen and jumped because of the Mercedes pit stop. There's no question about the Mercedes pit stop, because they did have to wait for Gasly, and that is just a fact. But it's kind of ironic that after this mental weekend and this chaotic Grand Prix, the championship battle is no different. The constructors, Red Bull are 26 points ahead now rather than just a single point. But Hamilton is still 4 points behind Verstappen, and this could have been 14 or perhaps even 21 if not for the brake bias switch which Hamilton accidentally flicked. Just talk us through the situation with Hamilton, and how big of a hit do you think Mercedes have taken mentally after this Grand Prix weekend?
Well, you look at sort of the gaps that Hamilton's had to overcome from being behind in a championship before, and it's been a lot bigger than this at a lot later stages. Obviously, it's only, I believe, 4 points to Verstappen at the moment, and we're very early on in the season. So I think in terms of drivers' championship, Hamilton will still be... We know Hamilton. We know he'll still be fighting for these race wins. And when it comes to France, I wouldn't put it past him to go out there and dominate every session. But when it comes to Verstappen fighting Hamilton, it's a bit different. You've got a younger gun. You've got someone who's gunning for their first world title and fresh on probably the fastest car on the grid now. And Mercedes, they are downplaying their chances a lot. We saw, obviously, in the practice sessions and at the start of qualifying, especially this weekend, Mercedes looked very, very poor. And you think, is it Hamilton overperforming this Mercedes, or is Bottas sort of underperforming way more than he should be? Because Hamilton is consistently still fighting for the podiums and for the race wins. which he should be with a car of what had the car of last year, I guess, that was an absolute beast. But Red Bull, you can see that they've come a long way towards the championship fight. And constructors, I think, will be a lot closer than many predict, because Perez as a second driver is someone incredibly consistent. And as at the start of the races, you always see Perez being ahead of Bottas. Is that huge for Red Bull? Can they get the rear gunner of Perez there? And Perez being there when Verstappen crashed out, when Hamilton had that brake switch, having Perez there as opposed to Bottas back in P14 or wherever the hell he was, it was a massive boost for Red Bull. And with, if say you put an Albon or a Gasly in that car, it would be a bit different to having Perez in it this weekend. So Red Bull have certainly come on a lot, which, as you mentioned, will be a certain mental strain for Mercedes, who have lost a lot of engineers and crew members to Red Bull themselves. So Mercedes are on the back foot, and they're on the back foot for the first time in a long time. And heading into France, I think it will be a bit different. They have not liked the street circuits at all, have Mercedes. They didn't like Monaco, and they certainly haven't liked Baku. But Hamilton's side of things is looking okay. Obviously, he said it was a mistake. He said it was his own mistake. Mercedes have forgiven him, as they usually do. But he ended up actually finishing behind Valtteri Bottas in the race, which was absolutely criminal considering the pace performance between the two throughout the weekend. But Hamilton has things on his side. Mentally, Hamilton is still within this championship without a doubt. We're only 4 points in it. That is absolutely nothing when it comes to Formula One these days. If you look at obviously the gap between first and second, that's more than 4 points itself. So Hamilton is still in the fight. It's whether that Mercedes and Bottas can get into the fight with the constructors, but I believe that the constructors will be a lot closer this year than it has been for a long time. And drivers-wise, Verstappen is going to keep this going towards the end. And even if the Red Bull, they do have the fastest car throughout the entire year and still continue the upgrades that they're planning, and Mercedes aren't throughout the year, then there's no doubt that Hamilton will still be in the title fight, because he is not one to give up, and he is not one to, I guess, sort of let the machinery deficit get to him, and he will fight for this championship without a doubt.
Now, I feel that the way that the weekend went for Bottas, I almost feel it was more Mercedes' fault than it was Bottas's fault that he was in that situation, because during qualifying, Mercedes sent Bottas out to work as a windbreaker or a tow for Hamilton, and so Hamilton was able to bag his qualifying lap by getting a tow off of Bottas. And then when it came to switching the role, they still sent Bottas out first, and they actually sent him out first in front of everyone. So Bottas was effectively giving everyone a tow in qualifying. So they didn't really give him a chance to put in a fast lap, because he was always working as the person giving everyone a tow. And as we have discovered throughout the years, that Mercedes is not good in traffic. And, well, Hamilton couldn't lay a finger on the Red Bulls because they were too quick for them. And Bottas found himself stuck behind the McLaren, which in multiple races this season has been the fastest car in a straight line. So, and the only place really the Mercedes had chances of overtaking was through slipstreaming. So trying to slipstream the fastest car on the grid and getting an overtake done was a lot easier said than done. So I feel, had they given Bottas the tow in qualifying, he'd have been a bit further up, and he would have been potentially up in the mix where he wasn't able to from P10.
And obviously, Verstappen, his race, just like Hamilton, did not go very well. And there's one driver I want to compare. You'll see the obvious reason I want to compare this in just a second. But Lance Stroll and Max Verstappen both suffered left rear tyre punctures going down the main straight at almost 200 miles an hour. What caused these tyre punctures is yet to be decided. Pirelli is saying that it's debris. The fans believe that it's tyre failures, which bring back memories of 2013, the British Grand Prix, Kimi Raikkonen running hashtag God Save Our Tyres on the side of his Lotus. I believe it was Kimi Raikkonen. And all of it is just becoming one big saga at this point, because there's been 8 major tyre failures in the last 12 months with Pirelli. They've got a contract until 2024 with Formula One. Now, with the whole tyre situation, what caused it, that's been discussed enough. But what is next for Pirelli, Ryan? because they've got these new 18-inch tyres coming in next year, which is the same tyres or the same style of tyres which you'll have on your ordinary road car or something along those lines. They'll be a lot more comparable with real tyres for the real world rather than the current tyres that we've got, which are primarily designed for close racing and tyre degradation to promote pit stops and more pit stops, which is pushing the teams to try and eke out these long stints on the hard tyres or the medium tyres and then doing a short stint on the soft tyres to maximize performance on your rubber and your different compounds. But realistically, who is, in your opinion, to blame for these situations? Is it the FIA? Is it the teams? Is it Pirelli? Or is it all just one big mess which Formula One is never going to get rid of? Because tyres have been a talking point ever since the sport began, ever since 2005, Indianapolis, and even before that. Just give me your opinions on this.
Well, obviously, there must have been some sort of concerns across the weekend, as it was said that all teams adjusted their tyre pressures by an extra PSI midway through the weekend. So there must have been some sort of concern over tyres. But obviously, going into next season when they're running the new tyres, obviously the actual tyres itself, the actual circumference is still going to be the same. It's just that it's going to be bigger rims, so there's going to be smaller sidewalls. They're not going to have the big sidewalls that are currently on the current tyres. So that could potentially have a bit of an impact. But at the end of the day, like Sebastian Vettel said, it's probably one of the worst tracks and one of the worst points for a tyre failure to happen, because they're going over 200 mile an hour at the points where the tyres were failing. And it was just so dangerous because luckily on both occasions, Verstappen veered to the right, and Strolls happened before he could even get to the pit lane entry, because obviously that pit lane entry was sticking out. So if Verstappen's car was to veer to the left, he would have just just gone nose first straight into the pit entry, which could have been an absolute colossal accident if it wasn't already a colossal accident. And yeah, I feel that it's got to the point now that, teams, the FIA, I feel they need to come down hard on Pirelli to say that, this is getting a bit too out of hand. It's getting a bit too dangerous.
And on one hand, several teams having quite a poor weekend in terms of their performance on track and what happened to them, Phil. But on the other hand, Ferrari have had 2 weekends now, which, other than Charles Leclerc losing pole position in Monaco because of arguably one of the team's biggest failures in quite a long time in terms of checking the car after the qualifying crash. But Charles Leclerc got pole position and then scored a solid 4th place, I believe, in the Grand Prix. And Sainz, despite having a issue in terms of locking up and going deep into the castle section, like Harry just mentioned, he did manage to score points. He finished 8th, which at the end of the day, 4 points in the bag. It's not bad for a weekend for Ferrari. Is this the sign that Ferrari is becoming more like themselves, essentially? They're building back what was lost in 2020, and arguably, right now, are better than McLaren.
I can say with certainty, having watched Formula One for as long as I have, teams go through peaks and troughs. You will have teams that will dominate. You will have teams that have dominated and then go massively downhill, and they will struggle for a while. And Ferrari are going through this. It's their turn. We've seen McLaren go through it over the years. We've seen Williams go through it. I personally think this is Ferrari starting to turn around their performance. Last year was just abysmal by their own standards. So anything they can achieve this year is basically impressive. As you say, Leclerc had pole in Monaco before having the incident with the barrier and losing out on that. But at the same time, both Ferraris were showing the good speed in free practice. Leclerc took pole in qualifying. So there is definite improvement with whatever they've managed to do, reshuffling, looking at the car, what they're able to do with the package itself. And there is, for me, an almost sort of old-fashioned battle coming back to Formula One, which has been sorely missed, which is like a Ferrari versus McLaren rivalry. I watched it back in the 80s and 90s when both teams were at the front of the field battling together, and it was great fun to see such titans of the sport having a go. Now, I would say they are starting to catch up with McLaren. For me, McLaren are definitely the number 3 team at the moment behind Mercedes and Red Bull this year. Nothing to say that they can't spring a surprise later on during the seasons. All it takes, as we saw at Baku, is for a few twists and turns in the race to suddenly appear, and you get people on the podium you wouldn't expect. But yes, I think Ferrari are catching up. I wouldn't say they're faster than McLaren. I'd say they're closing on them. And you're definitely going to see those two teams fighting for third place in the constructors this year. But at the same time, they're under a lot of scrutiny, and it is race by race. Whatever Ferrari can produce at Paul Ricard, I think, will be very telling. At the same time, they've proved the car is proven as a street circuit car. That's fine, and in some cases, if you can score as many points as possible in that situation, that's a big help to you whilst others struggle. I think, though, like I say, Paul Ricard is going to be a very telling situation for Ferrari. If they're still up the front, if they're able to maintain this pace in free practice and qualifying, able to shoot for pole, and if their race pace continues to keep them as a top 5 contender, then I would say that's an overall improvement to the package. If it doesn't, then there's still definitely some work to be done. And as I say, whilst Mercedes and Red Bull battle up front, McLaren are definitely sitting pretty in third place, ready to pounce should anything go wrong.
From one team who are in third at the minute in the Constructors' Championship to a team who almost finished third in last year's Constructors' Championship, Harry, I can really only come to you in this scenario because I know that you've been following their progress very, very closely. Sebastian Vettel has finally got his first podium with Aston Martin, and Aston Martin Formula One team have finally got their first podium in Formula One in their entire history in the sport. Ever since 1960 and their initial attempt to get into Formula One, they've never scored a podium. It was a strong race for Sebastian Vettel, qualified 11th due to the red flag, and Vettel was obviously quite annoyed at that, but he came back through the race, outdid everyone on a soft tyre stint, and had fresher tyres right at the end to push the leaders. Verstappen had his issue, Hamilton had his issue, Vettel stayed clean. It's just a solid weekend for him, really.
Solid is definitely the word. Of course, 2 halves to the garage. One will be distraught, obviously, with Lance Stroll, and one will be elated with Sebastian Vettel. But Aston Martin, the key to them at the moment is steady progress. They haven't made insane progress flying up the grid from, then getting knocked out in Q1, Bahrain, obviously, with Sebastian Vettel to going on pole. But it is steady progress, and Vettel has taken time to get used to this car. As I said last time out, in Monaco with the 5th place, obviously it's a track that's difficult to overtake, and getting that qualifying position was crucial. But this time out for Aston Martin, Seb didn't have that qualifying position. A length, he had the free choice of tyres, in which they decided to go into some fresh softs to get some advantage at the start, which worked. And one thing you do have to look at with Aston Martin is the strategies, especially in the last 2 weeks. They have been superb, Aston Martin's strategies. Stroll being stuck on the hard tyres for both Monaco and Azerbaijan at the start of the race looked to work out very good, obviously, until the tyre explosion for Stroll. But you would have expected Stroll would have been in the points if he would have finished the race. However, Vettel, you've got to give credit to him because he overtook Leclerc, he overtook Gasly, AlphaTauri and Ferrari, cars who have been significantly quicker in the opening races than the Aston Martin, and he overtook them within the space of a couple of laps. And the overtakes that he did make were actually very solid. And to be honest, one of the main overtaking points, obviously into turn 1, he managed to do that on Charles Leclerc on the restart and almost had Gasly on that same lap, but had to wait until turn 1 for the next lap. It was a brilliant race from Vettel, and obviously he was gifted sort of the podium with the Verstappen DNF and obviously Hamilton locking up in turn 1. But to finish on the podium, you have to finish there first. And obviously Verstappen, unfortunately, did not managed to finish. But you've got to give credit to Vettel and the job that he's done and the job that Aston Martin have done both on the pit wall and in the garage behind the scenes to get that car obviously further up the grid, because it's a lot better than it was in Bahrain. And Vettel's clearly got more used to the Aston Martin. And I was talking to my friend Ellie about this as well, but I haven't been as happy to see a podium for Ferrari, because I'm a massive fan of him and I believe that he deserves it. And that podium of Perez, Vettel and Gasly, I don't think you'll see a happier podium.
And with Pierre Gasly finishing in third, AlphaTauri, it's good progress for them.
Yeah, and I think it was, although it probably isn't the case, probably wouldn't be a bad idea as a second driver.
I mean, that's quite a bold statement there, Ryan. Does anyone care to comment? Pierre Gasly to Mercedes for 2022 if they don't want George Russell?
Absolutely. I agree with it completely. I haven't thought of it until then, but Pierre is consistent, and obviously that Red Bull did not suit him, but going into a Mercedes would be a different challenge. But I agree. If they don't go for Russell, I don't see too many better options than Gasly.
And Phil?
I would be surprised, I'll be honest, if Gasly goes there, because he's gone down the Red Bull route. Although personally, I think his time there is done and dusted. They've sort of burnt their bridges, and should he move on? At the same time, I've seen more shocking moves happen in the driver market in Formula One, and he is showing what he can do in that AlphaTauri. So I see Ryan's thinking. I'm 50-50. I'm sort of split on the fence on this one. I'd be surprised if it happened, but it's also a safe bet should they decide, Bottas, it's not working, we need someone else in there. And if they do think that maybe George does need a little bit longer to mature.
Phil, you've spoken about all of your years watching Formula One. I believe you said it was 1980 which you first started watching Formula One in. And just to test your knowledge here, obviously, I don't know if you've watched the podcast before, but we have a segment here called On This Day, where we take a look at the different Formula One World Championship seasons and what events actually happened on the day of recording.
Okay, let's see what we can do. Test the knowledge.
So this question is obviously to all three of you, as always. We'll get your guesses and then I'll reveal the answer. I actually have two questions today, and quite ironic in the fact that we're talking about how Lewis Hamilton had a poor Grand Prix, because on this day, 8th of June, the day we're recording, 13 years ago, was the 2008 Canadian Grand Prix. Now, this race is most famous for Lewis Hamilton hitting the back of Kimi Raikkonen when the red light at the end of the pit lane came on, and Hamilton didn't see it, and that led to Robert Kubica taking his first and only ever Grand Prix victory, and Nick Heidfeld following it up with a 1-2 finish. But my question to you three is how many laps did Hamilton actually lead of that Grand Prix up until his crash?
I'm going to hazard a guess at 20. I'm pretty sure. I think it was his first pit stop he took out Raikkonen, so he would have done a stint. So I'm going to hazard a guess at 20 and see if anyone betters me.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I'm going to take a slight conservative gamble and go for 22.
Yeah, since Phil went for 20, I'm going to go 19.
Ooh, I think, Harry, you're going to be disappointed because it was 18. He led laps 1 to 18 of the Canadian Grand Prix. But it's okay because the three of you can get it back. Obviously, I just mentioned it was Sauber BMW's first and only 1-2 finish. But who finished third in that Grand Prix?
It was either... I even want to say Massa or Vettel for some reason.
Okay, I'm going to hazard a guess. Thinking back to the drivers of that period, I'm going to go. My outside bet would be David Coulthard. I know he wasn't running too much longer after that, so I'm going to guess that was him.
Okay, David Coulthard.
I'm going to go with Massa.
Massa and Harry?
Barrichello.
Well, I can actually say, Phil, your knowledge has come in handy because it was David Coulthard who finished third in the Red Bull Renault.
Spot on. I feel vindicated.
And Ryan, just a bit of a consolation prize. Bit of a consolation prize because Barrichello actually did lead. He led laps 29 to 35 in that Grand Prix. Now, anyway, guys, moving back to modern Formula One. and the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, stepping away from Canada. Obviously, we won't be going to Canada this year, but fingers crossed we will be going there next year. And we've just mentioned Lewis Hamilton at the Canadian Grand Prix. He was driving for McLaren, and it was a poor day for McLaren at Canada. But in Baku, could we class the Azerbaijan Grand Prix weekend, Phil, as a poor weekend for them? Because Daniel Ricciardo crashed in qualifying. Lando Norris got a 3-place grid penalty for red flag infringements in qualifying. And realistically, it was a weekend which could have been so much better with the amount of carnage and chaos which went on. McLaren could have capitalized on it. And unfortunately, nothing seemed to go their way. But at the end of the day, Norris came away with, I believe it was 5th in the Grand Prix, while Daniel Ricciardo finished 9th. So 12 points for the Woking-based team. It's not bad.
It's not bad, but it's not great either when you consider their current form so far. Norris has had several podiums this year, and he's also been setting fastest laps and troubling Red Bull and Mercedes, whereas Ricciardo, again, is almost sort of playing catch up in a brand new team. Now, it's obvious you can allow someone that, within their first season to sort of say, right, I need to get used to the team, get used to the car, how everything works. But Daniel Ricciardo is also a race winner, so it shouldn't take him as long as it would take someone else coming to the team who doesn't have that experience to get up to speed. So Lando Norris is definitely leading the way. And I would say there was definitely an off race for the team. There were chances to capitalise, as you say, lots of things going on. It should have been a track that suited the McLaren better, but at the same time, they just weren't close enough or up front. They were making moves, they made progress through the field during the race, but I don't feel it was one. It's almost like they've had a missed opportunity to continue, and at the same time with Ferrari scoring as they did, it's definitely that they would have closed up on them, and that would have given Ferrari almost a boost as they go to Paul Ricard to think, right, we could do better. Saying that, I feel that McLaren will perform better at Paul Ricard. It's almost as if they'll be back to normal and challenging near the front, because as we said before, we know they have a fast car. It's a reliable car, and Lando has shown it's definitely capable of podiums, if not race wins, come the opportunity. So I would definitely say they've had an off weekend. They'll learn from this, they'll come back from this, but there are positives with Ricciardo's performance in that he was able to overtake, move up through the field, and get both cars into the top 10 and both of them scoring points. So progress on his side, but I feel Lando's slightly let them down on his side of the garage as well.
And we spoke about one AlphaTauri driver earlier. Moving on to the other AlphaTauri driver of Yuki Tsunoda, he came away with, I think it was 7th place in the end. Not a bad result for the Japanese driver. But once again, Ryan, there was almost this attitude from Tsunoda. We know he's young, we know he's filled with adrenaline, but this has been a talking point throughout the season. And in all honesty, I'm starting to get a bit tired of it, because Tsunoda's attitude to the team this season has been a bit off. And in comparison with his teammate Gasly, who's almost this upbeat, happy guy who just scored his 3rd podium in Formula One, there's a definite division down the team in the attitude between one garage and the other.
Yeah. Just at the start of the season, when we had Tsunoda come in, and obviously he had this attitude. Everyone was like, "Oh yeah, he's fiery, this young Tsunoda lad," and people liked it. But I think now it's starting to grind a bit, and people are starting to now, find him to be rubbing people up the wrong way. And yeah, I am kind of getting a bit tired of it now. Telling his engineer to shut up and other expletives down the line is not really acceptable. And I wouldn't expect anyone to address me the way he addresses his crew chief. So yeah, obviously I think I heard it that he's moved closer to the factory to understand the car and the team a bit better. But he needs to sort out this attitude problem because it really doesn't reflect well on him.
And one driver who's starting to get a bit more disrespectful to his team from one driver who's actually, his attitude has changed between his hiatus from Formula One, Fernando Alonso. Back in the day when McLaren would get a 6th place, he'd be quite happy, but on their poor days, Fernando Alonso would get quite down and antagonize the team almost to try and push them in a negative way, which never actually worked for him, especially at McLaren in the final few years. But at Alpine, he's almost had this reversal in psychological mentality, because rather than butchering the team for poor performance, whether it's his own or the car, this result in Azerbaijan, 6th place, it's a good result for the team. 8 points in the bag. It is a really good result, especially considering Esteban Ocon didn't finish the race. He was the first retirement of the Grand Prix. But Fernando Alonso has almost this switch flicked. He knows this season is going to be difficult, but he's waiting for next year for the team to have a better ability to challenge. Do you think that's what helped them to consistency this weekend? And at the end of the day, points on the board for Alonso?
Yeah, I do. I completely agree. I think that when you look at next year, there's going to be a massive revamp to obviously all the regulations, and you're going to need an experienced head within the team, within the sport in general, who will help you through these times to start of a new era. And Alonso, it does seem that he has one eye looking towards that future with Alpine. Of course, Alpine, they're not, I wouldn't say they've lived up to the expectations this season with Alonso and Ocon, to be honest. They are still behind, of course, AlphaTauri and Aston Martin now. But overall, I wouldn't say it's been a bad weekend. Obviously, Ocon, nothing could have been done about that. That was a mechanical issue. But Alonso he was very happy for his team for P6, which is great to hear. And obviously, going back to the Tsunoda point, it was Tsunoda in P7. He was quite rude throughout the race, but it's not something we often see with Alonso, especially this early in the season, if things aren't going well for him. As we know, it's obviously a new challenge for him within the team, but you would expect someone like Alonso to adapt to this car quickly, and it seems that he's slowly picking it up and has certainly got to grips with it this weekend. We saw the charge through the field, obviously on the restart, with 2 laps left to go, that charged him up to P6. And he did show a bit of his class and experience during Baku, I believe, and after qualifying, he was talking about how a lot of the drivers were taking unnecessary risks, and that's why there were so many red flags in the qualifying session, because these drivers were pushing the cars and to the limits that they simply couldn't reach, and to the limits that the drivers couldn't reach. And I think Alonso had a very steady head after Monaco. After the disappointment in Monaco, he came to Baku and he sorted himself out and got some very decent points, and I'm sure his team will be happy with him for this weekend.
Yeah, so some solid points for Fernando Alonso there, and also a solid point for Kimi Raikkonen, who took his first point of the season legitimately. Obviously, we know he scored points in Imola, but he got a penalty, which Alfa Romeo, I believe, have been unable to appeal. But at the end of the day, he's now got a single point on the board, and he is equaling his teammate in terms of performance now. But I'm not actually going to focus on Raikkonen. I'm going to focus on his teammate, because there's been quite a lot of talk about Giovinazzi and the fact that there are Ferrari juniors who are waiting in the wings for Giovinazzi's seat or Raikkonen's seat. And Phil, you've seen many different drivers come and go in Formula One, many different mediocre drivers, good drivers, and terrible drivers. Antonio Giovinazzi is a bit of an odd one, in my opinion, because 1 minute he's the best thing on the planet, and then the next minute he's absolutely nowhere. Do you think he has done enough this season, at least, to remain within Formula One, or at least move to a different category? Obviously, you're very well versed in the touring car world endurance championship, multiple different series. Is there any other place you think that Giovinazzi would fit better than Formula One? Because at this rate, still being outperformed by Kimi Raikkonen and crashing in qualifying at turn 15 like some other drivers, it's not really what you want to be doing when you're under the watch of Ferrari so closely.
No, I think with Giovinazzi, it's a case of I feel his time is coming to an end in the sport. He's had his chance with Alfa Romeo, and I don't feel that he's going to be there for a lot. I'll be honest, I'll actually be surprised if he's there after the season, unless he's already has a contract in place that I'm not aware of. Nowadays with Formula One, you sort of go two different roads if you don't remain in the sport. The left-hand road is going into IndyCar and going across the pond, as Romain Grosjean and Marcus Ericsson have done of late. The right-hand road is going into the FIA World Endurance Championship and signing up either with one of the works teams for the new hypercar class, or you go and sign up with one of the LMP2 teams in the second category. For Giovinazzi, I personally feel that whilst Ericsson made the move successfully, some would say, to IndyCar, he's doing better than expected, and he's definitely with one of the best teams. I can't see Giovinazzi going that way. I think if he doesn't stay in Formula One, he'd be in World Endurance Championship and easily finding a seat either with one of the works Ferrari teams, because you still maintain the Ferrari connection, or one of the hypercar teams. That being said, Ferrari do push their academy drivers very hard. They are very insistent in trying to get the next best drivers that they have in. One of them, ironically, with the name Schumacher, you have Mick Schumacher waiting in the wings, and he's in his first season of Formula One. But I suspect that there is a serious drive from Ferrari to get him up the ladder, to move him out of Haas, to move him up to Alfa Romeo, and then get him into a Ferrari seat, and almost try and relive the heydays of his father. That being said, again, time and experience is necessary. So I think Giovinazzi could soon find himself out of a seat. As you say, having been outperformed by Kimi Räikkönen, who's been in Formula One, some would say too long, but he's still capable of delivering. And if you can still deliver, as Alonso proves, as he's come back this year, if you can still deliver and you can get points on the board, you're doing the right thing as far as the team's concerned. So, yeah, I feel Giovinazzi's time is coming to an end. And I would be surprised if he is in about Alfa Romeo next year. I wouldn't be surprised to find him either racing elsewhere in Europe in World Endurance Championship, or possibly trying to make the leap across the pond as Marcus Ericsson done. I don't think he's done enough to keep his seat and watch one of the juniors come up and take it.
And I think that's probably one of the biggest questions. And that's actually the question I'm going to ask to the listeners today: is who do you think that in Formula One will get Antonio Giovinazzi's seat if he leaves at the end of the year? Do you think Callum Ilott will move up from being the Ferrari reserve and test driver? Or do you think a driver like Robert Schwartzman or Marcus Armstrong will take their place at Alfa Romeo and establish themselves as a better driver? Just let us know in the comments if you're listening to the podcast on YouTube, or if you're listening on Spotify, then go to Facebook or our Twitter and let us know what you think. But one driver who may be coming in, obviously the likes of Callum Ilott and the likes of Marcus Armstrong, to a driver who moved up from Formula 2 2 years ago, Harry. Nicholas Latifi, he hasn't had the easiest time in Formula One. Obviously, he's had George Russell as a teammate. George Russell has outqualified him on every single occasion that the two have been teammates. I think it's 43 times now that George Russell has outqualified a teammate in a row, something along those lines. Absolutely crazy at Williams. But it wasn't a mistake made by the driver at Baku which cost Latifi a possibly good result. It was the team, because the team allowed him to continue going after the red flag was called out. It was quite a rookie mistake from the engineer, who told him to continue going, and then only after he had gone past did they realise their mistake. That ended up giving Latifi a penalty, which cost him perhaps the ability to finish in front of his teammate, given George Russell's problems at the end of the race. But obviously we know that this wasn't the case. But do you think it cost him something more, or do you think it was just something which happened and it didn't really remove a possibly good result?
Well, in terms of the result for Williams, I don't think that they were looking at this weekend as a possible point scoring potential. I think that the only way that they would have done that would have been through a lot more crashes in the race. And the mistake made by the engineer to Latifi is bizarre. We've seen it with Hamilton, obviously at Hockenheim in that wet race where there was the in, and he stayed out. And then obviously at Mugello last year, I believe, with Raikkonen as well, he got a penalty for that. But it is harsh on Latifi, to be honest. But there is a certain element that the thing that you listen to first is you listen to your race engineer as a driver in that cockpit. That's the first thing that you should listen to. And it's harsh because he's got penalty points for it as well, I believe. I'm not sure if that's 100% true, but if that is true, then I don't think that many people can argue that that's not really fair, because if a red flag does get called out, your first sort of thought should be to come into the pits. But then when your engineer says that, when you're coming down the main straight, it is a massive conflict of opinions within Latifi's head. And I don't think you can really blame the driver as much as people are leading on to if the engineer was to say that, I guess. But in terms of points throughout the race, obviously, if Latifi was to stay or was to come in and not get that penalty, then he wouldn't have been in the points anyway necessarily. But he is now technically last in the World Drivers' Championship, considering Mazepin's performance has taken him above him based off of the positions gained, I believe. In the race, put Mazepin up to 13th or 14th, and Schumacher's ahead as well, and Haas now lead Williams. So they're both on 0 points, so it's mainly a minor thing, but finishing 9th in the Constructors is better than finishing palm last, and you never know that if these two teams continue the trend that they have throughout the rest of the year, that could become vital towards the end of the year, but I doubt it will have too much of an effect on Latifi or the team, but it is a bit of an annoying one for Latifi to have to go through, and he did seem very confused as he was going through turn one on the radio messages after the race.
Just to add to Harry's point there, and especially on this subject, this was something when I watched the race myself. My first thought came to after hearing the radio messages, and obviously, as Harry said, Latifi was very confused as he came through turn one. You almost felt sorry for him because whilst he's driving the car and you do listen to the engineer, you've got to rely on the fact that your team is doing the right thing. They're making the right decisions for you to be able to have the best performance whilst you're doing everything you can behind the wheel of that car. When Latifi was penalised with a drive-through, my first thought was, I almost wish, and if they do this, they don't make it very public in Formula One. I almost wish they took a book out of the Supercars Championship in Australia. Now, if the team make an incorrect decision like that isn't the driver's fault, because let's be honest, Latifi's listening to his race engineer. Do I come in? No, stay out. And then afterwards, it's, oh no, you should have come in. Sorry. Okay. So in that situation in Supercars where a team makes a mistake, they cause an issue that is not the driver's fault over a pit stop, garble, radio message, etc. They fine the team heavily, not just in money, but also in championship points as well. Now, obviously, Williams are yet to score and they're not off the board. But this is something that Latifi was almost an innocent bystander of. He's relying on being given the right information at the right time, what to do, because of the situation in the race that's been caused. If the team's getting it wrong, then they need to be fined monetary-wise and also points-wise. And if it means putting them into a minus point situation because they've mucked up in such a serious way during the fact of there is debris on the track, you've already had 2 crashes go on through the race because of tyre delaminations or tyre failures, however it's determined, you're putting drivers at risk, and there's no need to. They need clear messages. For me, it's that, Williams, and I'm a lifelong Williams fan, they made a mistake. They made a really big mistake, and Latifi was penalised incorrectly for it. It should be the team that suffers, and saying, okay, they're giving him a drive-through, he's lost position. He's not, he's being outperformed by Russell in most cases. So it's almost as if it's not doing him any further benefit by saying, you take the drive-through, even though your team's wrong. I think, and this is something I think Formula One needs to do, is there are other ways to penalise teams in this situation, and not the driver. And it would be good to actually see Formula One hold the teams more accountable for the mistakes that they make instead of penalising the driver on track, because it's penalising him, it's not actually penalising them at the end of the day if they're not in a point scoring position, as Latifi wasn't in this matter.
And obviously, like you just mentioned, with Supercars actually fining the teams for situations like this, do you believe that in future scenarios and possibly some form of rule change in the future for Formula One, what would your recommended course of action be for the likes of Michael Massey and the race directors and the stewards in dishing out these penalties, and how harsh would you make it?
I would make it very harsh. Formula One's a top echelon of motorsport. Let's be clear and simple about this. Everyone looks to be involved in Formula One as a fan, as a driver, as a team member. Everyone wants to reach the top unless they've got goals and clear goals to go elsewhere. If you're going to fine the teams, you need to make them open their eyes, raise their eyebrows with how you're going to fine them and go, right, you've done wrong. A 6-figure fine, you almost want to hurt the teams in the pocket, despite the fact of the budget limits they've got on that are coming in over the next few years. You want to financially hurt the team and make them look up and go, look, you've done wrong. You will pay for this. And I also support the idea of taking championship points off of them if that's possible, or putting them into a minus point situation to make the example to other teams. They've done wrong. We will not accept this. Formula One, unfortunately, is normally a catch-up sport when it comes to penalising drivers and teams for the indiscretions that come through that the teams are responsible for. If the driver is responsible, it's a drive-through, a time penalty, a post-race penalty. If the teams are responsible, they still penalise the driver. So they need to have their eyes open and their eyebrows roused. And something that, for me, I found very different for Formula One was the way that Michael Massey responded as race director for the comments that were coming through from Red Bull, from McLaren about other teams doing things, other drivers doing things, and also saying, look, in the case of McLaren saying, look, Tsunoda was wrong, he didn't slow down. Michael Massey actually saying, with the information in front of him, none of you slowed down. We need to talk about this in Paul Ricard. It's almost as if he was giving them a verbal slap and saying, look, you can sit there and tell on anyone you want. You're all just as bad as each other, and we'll address this. So it's good to see a race director taking on board the information he's got in front of him and not being afraid to actually stand in front and go, you're wrong, deal with it. I'm not changing it. I've got a race to run. And I'll be honest, he did run the race, in the end, which I think was the correct decision in the end. But yeah, definitely as far as teams being penalised, hurt them in the pocket, hurt them in the point standings. And if you do that straight away, they get the realisation straight away. You'll get the teams bucking their ideas up and working harder to go that extra level of performance when it comes to on track and making sure they support their driver as best they can.
Obviously, like you just said with the restart and the red flag, before Michael Massey was quite harsh on the teams, and there are definite things to learn from this weekend in terms of possible monetary or sporting fines. But Ryan, in terms of the race restart itself, we had 2 flat-out laps of full course, non-stop action right at the end of the Grand Prix, thanks to this restart. And that was really good to see, because traditionally Formula One has decided to end the race on the safety car, and that's a real anticlimax for fans. And if that did happen, it would have meant that we wouldn't have seen the likes of Pierre Gasly on the podium. With race restarts and the future implementation of sprint races in just a few Grand Prix time next month, in Silverstone is when we're going to see it at the end of July. Is there anything we can learn from this instance of sprint racing? And it was sprint racing. It was 2 laps, everyone on soft tyres, going for it as hard as they can, battling as hard as they can, which F1 can use and implement in their attempt to bring more action on the Saturday.
I think the main thing that we learned from this, the restart, is that it is definitely the older, more experienced drivers, apart from Hamilton, who decided to recreate a scene from Fast and Furious. They all kind of came out on top and showed that their experience in racecraft and keeping a cool head in those situations was what led them to pull their way through the field. There was obviously Vettel making a couple of overtakes, and then moving on down the field, you had Alonso having an absolute cracking start and getting his way past a few of the drivers, tripping each other over. There was an absolutely sublime move that he pulled on Tsunoda, and obviously we also saw Raikkonen pull his way into the points. And it seems that potentially, when it comes to the sprint races, those older, more experienced drivers who have got racecraft on their side could be the drivers coming out on top and pulling their way through the field when it comes to the sprint races.
With the older drivers like Sebastian Vettel and Fernando Alonso and Kimi Raikkonen making their way into the top levels and the top positions in the sprint races, Harry, is there any possible idea of some form of shootout system that could possibly be implemented if they were looking to mix up how the sprint qualifying races work? Or do you think that what Formula One currently has in terms of what it has planned is a good enough start in terms of trialing these new systems?
I think you just mentioned the key word there, trialing. I think that a lot of the point of this sprint qualifying aspect has mainly been brought in for viewership gain and on the Saturday to gain more viewers and to get more attraction towards the qualifying day rather than just the race. I think that it's always good in the sport to see change, and we've seen them try different forms of qualifying and different forms of point scoring within the past couple of years, which has just not stuck. But I do think that it never hurts to try another system, I guess. But if it doesn't work out, if the only reason why they're doing it, like I said before, was due to viewership and the races itself add no more entertainment and just confuse the drivers and is not fun for the drivers, then they need to scrap it as soon as they possibly can. But I do think that I can't really comment too much on it until we actually see what sprint qualifying is like, which, to be honest, I am relatively excited for. I'm excited to see how much of a difference it will make to the grid. And the drivers, of course, being completely new to it, it's not just based off the experienced drivers, I guess, having more knowledge on how things will work. Everyone's new to it. Everyone's at an equal playing field, minus the cars, obviously. But it will be an interesting dynamic, one that I'm pretty sure a lot are interested in looking at. But if it isn't as what everything's being hyped up to be, then I do think that it is cause for concern, and especially at a race like Silverstone to do it first is an interesting decision. Obviously, they know that a lot of British fans are going to be watching the Silverstone race, and they've added it, I think, specifically for the Saturday on Silverstone race weekend, simply because of that reason of viewership. But if it does work out well for Silverstone, then I'll eat my words, and I think that maybe it could be the future for F1, but I'm not too sure. And on the shootout system, then that could also be interesting. I think that drivers' qualifying battles tend to have become more of a thing, I think, within the past couple of years. Obviously, the likes of George Russell's helped that with dominating his teammate, or Mr. Saturday, as Crofty likes to call him, every single qualifying session. But I think that it's an interesting idea to trial, and one that hopefully does work out, but hopefully obviously doesn't cause any controversy, which, let's be honest, that F1 is going to do.
Well, I think that is the Azerbaijan Grand Prix weekend done and dusted, guys. Thank you very much, you three, for joining me, Harry, Phil, and Ryan. And thank you very much to you, the listener, for tuning in to Maximum Downforce, episode 6 for the Baku City Circuit race. It has been a fantastic weekend. A lot of things learned, a lot of things gained, but ultimately the championship is just as close as it was as we came into the weekend. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to listen to the radio station, the new Downforce radio app is available on Android devices, as well as our website, www.downforceradio.uk. And as well as that, you can take a look at our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, Downforce Radio. And if you're listening on YouTube, you can take a look at the YouTube channel and all of the fantastic videos that we've got, the Retro Racers Managers League, and several other different series that we've got going on there. Thank you very much for listening. Have a wonderful evening, and goodbye.